Very good, and congratulations for getting this far. This will be the final one of these briefings going through the independent hearings panel. At the end of this briefing, I'll do a brief update on the reform program from central government, and we'll also go through some of the amendmenting processes, because they're different from last time round. The scope of this briefing covers the ecosystems and Indigenous biodiversity chapter and the infrastructure, ecosystems and Indigenous biodiversity chapter. Eco and Inf-Eco, as we like to call them in planning. And I'll hand over to Matthew. You're not Matthew, you're Adam. Adam.
You don't know Matthew from Adam?
I don't even have a Matthew, do I?
That's going to stick now. Hello, good afternoon, councillors. My name is Adam McCutcheon, not Matthew McCutcheon, one of the team leaders in the district plan team. Nice to see you all again. So as Sean, I'm going to call you a different name, mentioned, we're here to talk about biodiversity today. So firstly, we're going to start with a bit of background and an explanation of the regulatory context. We're going to start with how we got to notifying the district plan and its approach to Indigenous biodiversity. We're going to start right back in 2019. That's when I didn't have any children and I looked a lot younger, a bit more fresh, and I slept well. The Backyard Taonga project kicked off, and it was the first conversation, some of you may remember it, with landowners about the concept of protecting Indigenous biodiversity, not just on public land but on private land. I've got a next slide which goes into a bit more detail about the program, but in short, when this kicked off, it formed the basis of the identification of significant natural areas, or SNAs, for the following spatial plan, draft district plan, and then proposed district plan. Later that year, the government came out with a draft national policy statement on Indigenous biodiversity. There had been an earlier attempt back in 2010, which was shelved, to introduce national direction on Indigenous biodiversity. This council made a submission on that draft national policy statement, and in that submission it raised concerns about the strictness of the proposed provisions and a lack of support for landowners who would be affected by the proposals and for the council to implement the national direction. So that submission went off to the government to consider, but the content, the drafting of the provisions and the policy approach in that draft MPS were used to inform the draft district plan approach. In October 2020, the council consulted on the draft spatial plan, so the big conversation around growth and change, but also about protection of the natural environment. Again, in that consultation, owners had the opportunity to request a site visit from council officers and an ecologist to understand what values they may have on their property, and to make sure that the mapping of SNAs was correct, or if it wasn't correct, to amend them. The following year, after the adoption of the spatial plan, the council consulted on the draft district plan. And so for the first time, a draft set of rules attached to the identification of significant natural areas were presented to the community for comment. There were submissions on whether the balance of those rules were fair, or whether they were too strict or too lenient, and the further site visits were offered to landowners to check, again, whether the identification of SNAs was correct or not. Taking us to June 2022, the Environment and Infrastructure Committee took the decision to notify the proposed district plan. As part of that decision, it decided not to identify significant natural areas on privately owned residentially zoned sites, but it did on privately owned and publicly owned rural land. So for to throw some numbers in there, around 5,200 hectares of significant natural areas, SNAs, was identified in the district plan. For another metric, that's around 3,000 Sky stadiums. There were around 200 private property owners who were affected by that decision. The area of residentially zoned land which was not identified would have affected 1,300 landowners and comprised 181 hectares. So it's about 37 Sky stadiums, just to get some comparison between numbers in there. A bit more detail on the Backyard Taonga program. So the genesis and why this all started was because of misalignment between the 2000 district plan with the requirements of the regional policy statement produced by the Greater Wellington Regional Council and Council's own direction in the 2015 Our Natural Capital Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, which directed Council to investigate the protection of biodiversity on private land. The program and the identification of SNAs was based on a desktop audit by ecologists who reviewed aerial imagery of bush, assessing that against the regional policy statement criteria to come up with the indicative SNAs. There was a mail out to 1,700 landowners back in 2019, and I remember folding in letters and stuffing them in envelopes with my aching back. Those landowners received maps, and there's a picture of what they look like on screen here with an indicative SNA, and a letter inviting a site visit and a discussion with council officers as to what this could mean. There were 148 site visits between 2019 and the notification of the proposed district plan where amendments were made to the boundaries of SNAs. And some of the reasons that those areas were amended were because resource consents or building consents had been granted already in areas where bush would need to be removed to exercise that consent, or where the vegetation wasn't present. So there'd been a lag between the aerial imagery and then going out and looking on the ground and seeing what was there. There's a piece here around higher order direction. So higher order direction shapes what district plans and our district plan must do to address a resource management issue and provides instructions on how we're to do that. If we start at the very top of the tree, the RMA, since 1991, councils have had an obligation to recognise and provide for the protection of areas of significant Indigenous vegetation and significant habitats of Indigenous fauna. That's under Section 6 as a matter of national importance. That endures today. Sitting underneath that requirement in the legislation are two national policy statements. The first one being the National Policy Statement on Indigenous Biodiversity 2023, we'll call that the NPSIB, and the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement 2010, or the NZCPS. I'll get into a lot of detail in the NPSIB next, but at a high level, what it does is it directs local authorities on how we should discharge our RMA requirements to protect Indigenous biodiversity. So what the NPSIB does is it provides a consistent framework for how we are to identify what is an SNA and what our district plan rules must do to protect them. There's also some set timeframes in there that councils have to meet to bring those provisions into their district plan. This NPS doesn't override the NPSUD on urban development. We still need to meet those requirements and find a balance between the both of them, as well as all the other national policy statements. For the coastal policy statement, there's been one of these since 1994, and no surprises, it provides direction on how we are supposed to manage Indigenous biodiversity in the coastal environment. So there's always been a direction for the coastal environment, but not everywhere else. Sitting underneath these two national directions is the regional policy statement from the Greater Wellington Regional Council. What that document does, or is intended to do, is to provide Wellington region-specific directions to city and district councils on how we're supposed to implement a national policy statement. That document, the regional policy statement, had always provided Wellington City Council and all the other city and district councils requirements to manage significant vegetation since it was notified back in 2009. And I've mentioned before that our 2000 district plan didn't do that. The Regional Council has just gone through the process of updating the RPS to implement the NPS. So now through the cascade of national directions through to the regional directions, we as Wellington City Council have some pretty clear directions to manage Indigenous biodiversity and how we're to do that. The regional policy statement provisions to manage Indigenous biodiversity, some of them are under appeal, and actually this week they're being mediated in the Environment Court.
Sorry, can you just go back one? So who actually owned the second stage of that? Who produced the policy statement?
That's the Regional Council.
No, the middle one.
Oh,
the government, normally through the Ministry for the Environment.
Okay, so Parliament passed the top one, the Ministry for the Environment does the second one, and then the Regional Council kind of interprets the top two and comes up with it. Yeah.
That's correct. I'd also point out the dates on them. So you'll see that the NPSIB was in 2023, and the Regional Policy Statement Change 1 is currently still live. So it's these two instruments we've had to adjust during the district plan process too, as we could.
And I mean, how? Sorry, I don't want to sort of like, bog down on questions, but how sort of specific are these policy statements?
The NPSIB is very specific, and there's little room for district plans to manoeuvre away from those directions. I'll get into a lot of detail on following slides, but there's not very much room to manoeuvre at all. So on the NPSIB, so it was gazetted in July 2023, following the submissions that we made back on the draft way back in 2019. So the direction of the draft NPS was used to inform our draft district plan provisions. The previous government and its intentions to have it finalised prior to the 2023 election was sort of a consideration that was in play for submitters during the submissions and definitely the hearings process for this topic last year. As a result of this NPS, there have been some pretty significant changes that will take you through to the biodiversity provisions to that which we had in our notified plan. Compared to the more generic direction of the regional policy statement, this NPS provides specific and also wide-ranging direction on how we're supposed to manage biodiversity. It tells us what is an SNA. It tells us what our planning provisions must say to protect them and when we are to include those. Compared to our notified plan, it's very strict in that now effects on SNAs have to be avoided. Prior to that, our notified plan allowed there to be adverse effects on significant natural areas, where if they weren't avoided, they were mitigated, and if they couldn't be mitigated, they were remedied, and if they couldn't be remedied, they were either offset or compensated. So there was a presumption that you could do things within SNAs. That's very much flipped now with the intentions of the NPSIB. It also has a focus not just on significant natural areas, but also on biodiversity more generally. And this is where the NPS and our notified plan depart. There are considerations to manage Indigenous biodiversity even outside of significant natural areas. The government had previously indicated that it would look at changes to this NPS as part of its Phase 2 reform, and Sean will talk to that later, but that hasn't eventuated, and instead there's an indication that it will be addressed through Phase 3. This NPS doesn't apply to renewable electricity generation or to the national grid, so Transpower's operations. Enter the Resource Management, Freshwater, Other Matters and Amendment Act. So you will remember we came to committee in May 2024 with a bill the government had prepared that was had quite a broad smattering of different resource management issues that were concerning them. So this was the one that had coal mining in it. I remember that came up as a topic of discussion.
Move on.
Moving on quickly.
Don't trigger Iona.
The biodiversity components of this bill were intended to act as sort of a down tools stop work order for those councils who hadn't already notified a plan change to implement the NPSIB. It addressed those parts of the NPSIB which were most concerning to the government, and it was intended to give them time to do a review of how they wanted to do biodiversity policy in New Zealand. The council submission sought clarity on what is the bill doing and how does it relate to us. There was a bit of confusion as to how it would play out for councils who had already notified a plan change to implement the NPSIB. Sort of the questions around, does it have retrospective effect for us or not? As it eventuated, after the bill had its royal assent in October, for those councils who hadn't notified a plan change, there was those requirements to notify a plan change identifying SNAs were suspended until after December 2030. But if you had already notified a plan change to implement the NPSIB, that document still must be implemented, and the strict provisions of the NPS applied to SNAs that you've identified, and the identification of those SNAs is legal. What it did mean, though, is that SNAs that have been identified in the plan can't be extended beyond or increased in size, but they could be reduced in size. In addition, the Amendment Act didn't suspend those requirements for councils to manage Indigenous biodiversity outside of district plans, so that's still a requirement for our district plan. If we put this all together in a sequence, because there's been quite a few different pieces that have happened over the past couple of years, and in a bit of a timeline, going back to the notification of the plan, so we didn't identify SNAs on residential land, but we identified them everywhere else. We had more lenient provisions in our notified approach. The MPSIB then came in 2023. It had more strict requirements, and it also required us to turn our mind to biodiversity outside of SNAs. Then last year, the Regional Council started aligning its regional policy statement with the strict directions of the MPSIB. We've also got to give effect to those strict directions through the regional policy statement. The amendment bill came in the middle of our hearings process, and it was a topic of discussion for submitters. We made a submission on. It then had its royal assent in October last year, which suspended requirements for those councils who hadn't already started, but we must soldier on. And then the Regional Council made its decisions on its regional policy statement in October last year, taking us through to next month, where you will make decisions on the independent panel's recommendation. So this sort of amalgam of a changing policy feast and legislative settings was all considered by the Independent Hearings Panel and is reflected in their report. They considered how all of this would sit in the timing of the various events. So the high-level matters responded to by the notified chapter. Going back to my comments about the 2000 plan, it didn't address biodiversity very well at all. It also didn't address how infrastructure should be operated or developed or extended within those areas. It brought in provisions to do just that. Very briefly, the purpose of this slide is to show that there was still quite a great deal of interest in this topic through the hearings process, even without SNAs being identified on residential sites. So the key matters considered by the panel, there were three of them. Private land and how identifying SNAs on private land would restrict property rights and what the effective planning restrictions would be. How the MPS should be implemented in the middle of a hearings process, and how biodiversity outside of SNA should be regulated. We're going to start with some recommendations that are consistent with the notified plan. So the Independent Hearings Panel has not recommended identifying SNAs on privately owned residential land. And probably the most definitive reason for that is that the Amendment Act has come in and has stopped SNAs from being able to be extended onto those areas. In addition to that, the panel had concerns of natural justice for those people who would then be affected by the extension of SNAs onto residential land, but hadn't made submissions to enter into the district plan process. And so there would be 1,300 residentially zoned property owners who would probably want to have a say, but may have thought that it was a done deal by the time the plan had been notified and didn't engage in the process. So for those people, their only recourse would be through appeal to the Environment Court. The panel's concerns were compounded by some economic evidence that was presented to them around the effects on property value through reduced development capacity that SNAs could have on individual landowners. While the panel accepted that having a residential zoning is not sort of a veto or a get-out-of-jail-free card for the identification of SNAs, their view was that doing it through a hearings process where people were not involved and didn't have the ability to have their say was not fair to the principles of natural justice. In addition, the panel didn't consider that there was really compelling evidence that Wellington City was experiencing a biodiversity crisis. Evidence was presented to the panel that actually it could be the opposite that's going on, that there's a flourishing of biodiversity within the city. So while they accepted that more could be done, they weren't convinced that identifying SNAs on residential land was the way to do that. evidence was shown to them that there's actually parts of the ecosystem or different ecosystems that are doing really well through a combination of natural regeneration, but also the hard work of community groups and landowners to undertake restoration works on their properties. Flowing from the NPSIB, there's been a recommended tightening up of the policy framework. So as I talked to before, that approach where you can create adverse effects, but you need to then minimise, remedy, offset and compensate for them, that's known as the effects management hierarchy. So that was the approach that we had for pretty much all activities in the notified plan. The NPS has then come around and flipped that presumption that you need to now avoid adverse effects. Only specific activities under the NPS and the recommended provisions can use the effects management hierarchy now as the default pathway. So those are nationally and regionally significant infrastructure operations, mineral and aggregate extraction, and there's some limited circumstances where that can occur, or the development of a single residential unit on a site that has SNAs identified on it. Additionally, under the NPS, the hearing process could be used to identify established activities, so things that are existing uses that are already going on that should have some allowance to continue even with an SNA identified on that site. And I've got some detail on what they are on the next slide. There may be a pathway, even with that avoidance policy framework, for people to do works within an SNA in situations like if an ecologist goes out and finds that there actually isn't an SNA here or it doesn't meet the criteria. So those changes to the rule framework, so previously there were multiple rule steps in our notified plan, so from permitted to controlled to restricted discretionary to non-complying. With the NPS coming in, it gives the ability to really simplify that framework. So now the rule framework is either you're permitted or you require a discretionary resource consent. So it is a much simpler consenting framework, if that. But what it's meant, though, is that there's now no permitted pathway for council tracks or park sport and recreation tracks through reserves if there's an SNA. They need to avoid adverse effects on the SNA, like everyone else, essentially.
So just to be clear, when we say there's no permitted pathway, you go through a discretionary consent in order to build those tracks. So it's not automatically permitted any longer.
Ask another question. So you're talking now about SNAs, but I take it these are the rural SNAs, are they? So all of this is just about rural SNAs because residential SNAs are off the table.
Yes, they're also in open space land as well.
Oh, okay.
That's where the tracks probably
Thank
cause
you.
problems.
Yeah.
So
We've collapsed into questions.
Yep.
Laurie. I'm happy to wait.
yeah, just rounding out the list of permitted activities there. So existing council tracks through SNAs, there are permitted thresholds for clearance, so they can still be there and we can clear up to 2.5 metres either along the side of that track to allow it to be maintained, as well as where there's an existing building and there's an SNA around it, you can clear some of that SNA to, say, get scaffolding up to replace a roof on a rural building, for example, for quarries to be maintained and operated, and to exclude stock through waterways. So there are some very narrow exceptions there. Carrying on. Questions?
Yeah, to Kopaho, I mean, I think we've got a plan to put tracks and trails through that, which will be a highly designated SNA area. So what will that mean now? We have to go through a resource consent process or a consent process to be able to put those tracks and trails through?
We can return some specific advice on that area. I do know that there was potentially a consent that was already in train, and that would have been assessed under the notified rules before these ones had come in, but we'll firm that up.
Yeah, no, that would be good to get an understanding of
yes,
how it will impact that. And a good question is, if it does impact council in that area, is there more cost to council to do that?
Yeah, certainly for any consent that or any walking track through an SNA after decisions, if these more stringent rules are adopted, there would be a consenting requirement. There might have been one there before, and it may be more tough to get that consent or require greater offsetting or compensation.
Sorry, there's a couple of other questions, but on that one, which I think was a really good question, I mean, will it be very onerous for you to produce a small sort of explanation of how those tracks, that existing consenting would work, and also how that would work were we starting from afresh, just so we could see how the changes would actually flow through? Was that
Certainly, yeah, we can do
that's
that.
not a problem?
No, not a problem.
Councillor McNulty, we've got a question for you.
Yeah. So discretionary resource consents. I'm thinking of up in Nio, the top of our Street, track builders there had to spend about $50,000 because of skinks located. So is that a ballpark figure for a discretionary resource consent, firstly?
So it would really depend on the extent of mitigation that was required, how many, what ecological advice was needed, whether there was relocation that was required for skinks or any other type of fauna. So it would really depend, but I mean that is a good example for that particular project, how much it cost.
Okay, so two more. This is if private groups are wanting to build tracks, still through an SNA or reserve land, so they're doing it as volunteers on behalf, they're still captured by the discretion resource consent requirement, I assume?
Correct.
And if we don't want this gigantic piece of bureaucracy getting in the way, what are the options available to councillors when it comes to us for decisions to reject it or amend it?
So we'll have to provide you with some specialist advice on it, simply because of the higher order direction. So what I'll need to work out is whether you have the power to reject this and become inconsistent with the NPSIB. So I'll provide a written answer on that for you.
Cool, yeah, I'd be very interested in seeing amendments around limiting this direction, because I can just see it completely choking the ability to build tracks in the city. So thank you.
Councillor Randall.
Sorry, can I ask a 101 question? An area being designated as a significant natural area, does that mean it has significant Indigenous biodiversity, or that it would be expected to have significant natural biodiversity?
So if we go back to the genesis of the identification exercise and how it was undertaken, so it was a desktop exercise. So aerial imagery in the first instance was used to identify against the criteria of the regional policy statement. Is it likely to be an SNA, or would it meet that criteria? It is evident from the site visits that there have been changes because some of the vegetation, for example, isn't as mature. When you go out in the site visit and it wouldn't meet the criteria for scheduling as an SNA. So there could be areas that don't meet that criteria, or are likely to be areas that don't meet that criteria, but the desktop exercise has flagged them. That's a piece there around what's the most efficient way to identify them, and how does the MPS and RPS require us to identify them.
Okay, and so you also noted that under the recent government direction, and possibly, the areas that are currently in the designated as SNA in the current district plan are the desktop exercise areas as well. So that extra information hasn't been enacted or applied to the areas that are currently in the district plan.
So it has because that when they were initially identified back in 2016 under the regional policy statement criteria, site visits then occurred. There were trimmings ins and outs where SNA was not present. They were all reassessed against the MPS criteria, and it's essentially exactly the same. There are some very minimal changes and differences between the RPS and the MPS IB criteria. So it's all been re-evaluated, and everything that is identified in the recommendations versions from the Independent Hearings Panel meets with that MPS IB criteria.
Okay. And is it, I guess in terms, I just want to follow up with Councillor McNulty's comments too. Amongst the powers is not just possibly the way that the, about us having to do this, or rather that the decision actually has already been made and we are unable to enable any more discretion than what you've recommended or permitting. I guess the other thing is it within our power to change the areas of designation? Because you talked about the new legislation stating that it is permitted to retreat. You can't expand them, but you can make them smaller.
Yep. So what we'll do is provide some specialist advice on essentially where the discretion is that you can exercise and how you could amend the recommendation of the commissioners here. The other thing I will furnish with that are what the consenting architecture may look like. So it might be possible, for example, to get a global consent for walking tracks. It might be possible to consent through an instrument like a trails plan where you had laid out them in advance. So there are a few permutations of this, and I think that understanding the tools available to you and what the risks are of deploying those different tools is probably the best way forward from here.
Okay, and one last question. The City Council's Parks and Recs teams do work across these areas. Given that these areas need resource consent, how are they able to operate? Have they got a resource consent to do work inside these areas?
So up until now, they haven't had to get resource consents because we haven't had SNAs in the district plan. I touched on before in response to Councillor Deputy Mayor Fern's question, I believe a global consent has been applied for or has been worked through to try and get consent, a global consent to make new tracks within SNAs before any new stricter rules would come in. We'll confirm that in the written piece back. But if you were to adopt and agree with the panel's recommendations, it would be a tougher consenting pathway to do new tracks from now on.
Okay, so but the City Council has applied for its own resource consent for its own tracks on its own reserves?
I believe so, yes, and we'll provide a written response on that one.
Okay, thank you.
I also just wanted to flag in response to Councillor McNulty's question, and it'll come through in the written piece that we'll put together. If a decision was taken not to do this framework recommended by the panel, it would be inconsistent with both the MPSIB and the regional policy statement, because that's just been aligned with the MPS above it, going back to that hierarchy of planning documents. That'll come through. I just thought it'd be good to flag now. Okay, other key changes recommended by the panel. So one of the other key differences between the notified plan and the MPSIB.
Sorry, I've got my hand up.
Oh. Sorry.
Got my hand up.
Councillor Calvert, you are most welcome to ask a question. Sorry, I didn't see you.
Thank you. Look, back to the SNAs, and in particular for the residential ones. So the residential SNAs are no longer there now. Is that correct?
That is correct. The IHP have confirmed the decision of council not to impose them on residential areas.
Okay, so could we get a message out to all those ones that had received communication a few years ago, letting them know? Because it did cause quite a bit of angst in the community. And so I think it might be helpful if we could tell them what the outcome of all of this is.
Very Very good. I'll take it under consideration and provide advice in the communication section of the district plan paper as to what that comms plan would look like, Councillor Gilbert.
That would be helpful. When's that district plan paper coming back?
I believe it's the 13th of June.
Okay.
12th of June, sorry. I get it wrong every time.
Yeah, if you could let us know what it would be, how would we advise them?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, that will also mean that we'll be able to advise them of the confirmed decision by the council, which would have been taken at the committee that day.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, carrying on. This slide here is actually in part relevant to Councillor Calvert's question there around what are the settings in residential areas. So as I was saying, the other key difference is this requirement now to manage Indigenous biodiversity outside of SNAs as well. This wasn't something that we did in the notified district plan. So what the NPS requires is that effects management hierarchy, the avoid, if you can't avoid, remedy, mitigate, so on, so on, so on, approach is used where there could be significant effects on Indigenous biodiversity even outside of SNAs. So one of the areas where this may be relevant would be in those areas where we haven't identified SNAs on residentially zoned land, because there has been identified that there are areas of bush which could be significant. So this requirement was not suspended by the Amendment Act. So last year it wasn't suspended, it still endures, and it's actually been a requirement since the NPS came in July 2023. So since then, resource consent applicants have had to provide ecological assessments where more than 50 square metres of bush has been proposed to be removed, where there's their ability in the plan to consider ecological effects. So this would typically be for discretionary or non-complying earthworks consents. So this is outside of SNAs. So it's likely that this will be something that will have to continue per the direction of the NPS-IB. So this hasn't been a rule in the plan itself, rather sort of an approach that's been applied for resource consents where relevant, because the council still has to implement the NPS-IB even if there isn't a specific rule in the plan for it. So the panel received advice about formalising a rule trigger to meet this requirement of the NPS-IB. So that was either a rule trigger of 100 to 300 square metres of bush removal, Indigenous vegetation removal in urban areas, or 3,000 in rural areas, so that these sort of outside SNA requirements could be clearly identified and upfront in the plan. Like the residential SNA recommendation, they didn't consider that this was an appropriate thing to do, because people who had areas of bush on their property which might fall within these thresholds, again, haven't had the opportunity to make a submission and comment on this change in the middle of a hearings process. They also received a lot of some evidence that there would be some pretty significant impacts on planned development capacity through requiring additional resource consents to remove vegetation outside of SNAs, particularly in urban areas, and there would be an additional barrier to housing development. So what the panel have recommended is that there's a policy in this chapter now that significant adverse effects on Indigenous biodiversity outside of SNAs be managed through that effects management hierarchy. And it will be relevant for discretionary or non-complying resource consent. So like that situation I explained before around a square metre removal of bush, that will likely still continue after these settings come in.
We have a question from Councillor McNulty. Ben?
Sorry, it wasn't super urgent. It was just, you mentioned that these decisions have flowed downstream from the regional plan. So I was wondering how, say, PCC, or I know have been going through their district plan, if they'd had any mitigations or similar challenges and how they might have dealt with them. So don't have to necessarily answer it now. It could come back more as written advice, but I was just, some of the issues we just raised in the prior lot of questions, how are other partners dealing with it in the region, given they're signed up to the same framework?
I can provide a bit of an explanation now, and we can bolster that in a written response. But in short, so for Hutt City, their plan notification came after the gazettal of that Amendment Act, so they're not. They have the suspended requirements to do SNAs until 2030, so they haven't identified SNAs in their plan and they can't. We're in a different position. We've already notified that plan change. We've already got SNAs. We still then have to apply the MPSIB. Porirua City identified significant natural areas in its proposed district plan review a few years ago now, so they've already got SNAs in their plan, and they now need to apply this MPSIB framework to their plan. So it's played out differently across the region depending on where you're at in your plan review cycle and where you are at in implementing the MPSIB.
Thank you.
Councillor Free.
Yes, so I just want to clarify, there is a trigger level at which you need to start looking at some mitigation. And is that trigger level, you said 1.50, but then you said, I think it had been suggested 100 or 2 or 300. Has that figure been decided, the trigger level?
So the latest ecological evidence or advice through the hearings process was that at around 100 square metres in an urban context, it's probably worth considering whether the effects management hierarchy is appropriate, and 3,000 square metres in rural settings.
Thank you.
In respect of changes to the extent of SZAs through the hearings process, so there were many submissions seeking changes to the extent of SNAs. Site visits were undertaken with an ecologist and a member of the planning team. There were 10 changes to SNAs made in response or recommended in response to those submissions. They're in the areas here detailed on screen: Long Gully, Upper Stebbings, and a few others. The other chapter that's part of this series and is subject to the MPSIB is the infrastructure ecosystems and Indigenous biodiversity chapter. It's a similar sort of set of changes that have been recommended by the panel here. So the MPSIB is still relevant. That narrower and more specific scope to do things as a permitted activity before you need to avoid adverse effects also applies to infrastructure. So there's been a tightening up of that framework. The content in the chapter related to the national grid has been removed, and now it's in its own infrastructure national grid chapter, and that was part of the previous briefing. Yeah, so that's really all much that there is to the infrastructure piece. Would you like to pause now for questions? Or?
Sorry, Councillor Free.
So there's an exclusion for electricity infrastructure, but you have to sort of wonder about our tip and, that, like, what sort of provisions, I know we don't plan to extend it exactly, but if we did have to, how would that leave us off?
Yeah, so that exclusion for electricity transmission is built into the MPS. That was a call that the government made in developing it. Our TIP also has a designation over it, which allows us to do works for the purpose of sanitary purposes, landfill, so that will endure, that will continue irrespective of the identification of SNAs.
Yeah, and I see you've got a picture there of what looks like Scorching Bay.
Yeah.
And of course there's been heaps and heaps of planting to make it all more special. Will that be a problem when we come to put tracks in on Mata Moana, for example?
So there are SNAs identified for the end of the peninsula. This is one of the difficulties with this whole subject, frankly, in that the community in Wellington and a succession of councils have done a remarkable job in restoring Indigenous biodiversity, something we're famous for internationally. However, we now have a regulatory framework that work is almost held against us in some ways.
Yes.
And so the tricky thing here is figuring out what the room to move is, how we can best retain that natural capital that Wellington has built up, whilst making it workable for us to live our lives here. And so, yeah, it's difficult.
feels as if one should go and chop a few things down in advance.
Please don't tell me these things. I should point out these controls have had legal effect since notification, just in case anybody wants to do some topiary.
Thanks for clarifying that, Sean. So the panel also recommended the council look at some future work related to this topic. So SNAs on residentially zoned land. So repeating my point before that the zoning that you have does not provide an exception to the identification of an SNA under the NPSIB. Council should consider that along with the competing directions of the policy statement on urban development. How do you balance the protection of Indigenous biodiversity and our requirements to enable development capacity within the city? But it noted that any identification on residential sites and the extension of what we've already identified can't take place until after 2027. By that time, we might have a different system for managing biodiversity. Sean will speak to that. In addition, this approach to managing Indigenous biodiversity outside of SNAs, they recommended that the council consider comprehensively having regard to this topic with the competing directions of the NPS. So we've got a policy, but is that the most transparent or clear way for managing this requirement of the NPS? And also the reasonable use of land. So whether identifying SNAs like we have done on rural sites deprives people of the ability, the reasonable ability to use their land. So that's looking at the tensions between the rural zone provisions, which are enabling people to do rural activities, but then there are SNAs identified on those properties which restrict them from doing rural activities. So how does that balance sit? So next steps, so on any decision, there's likely to be appeals by both advocates and opponents to the protection of Indigenous biodiversity in the settings which you will land on. The regional policy statement change 1 appeal resolution, so for the past 2 weeks that's being mediated, and the settings which the regional council have implemented are being mediated now. It may be that depending on where they get to, the district plan also needs to change to align with them. In addition, through our Te Ao Māori plan change, the panel noted that the recommendations that they have put to you don't fully fulfil the requirements to engage and work with Māori to develop district plan provisions to protect Indigenous biodiversity. That was came down to the timing of the notification process when the NPSIB came in and where the hearing took place. So they've recommended that we look to do that more fulsomely, and the upcoming Te Ao Māori plan change could be a vehicle to do that.
So I've got a question about the appeals. It didn't strike me that there was actually a lot of discretion. I mean, and so what are the sort of scope for appeals?
So speaking to some of the key matters of contest in the hearing, so there were some submitters challenging that residential SNAs could not be put back in through the process. There was a bit of a challenge around you should have a rule trigger to manage Indigenous biodiversity outside of significant natural areas. Private property owners who have SNAs identified on them may challenge the decision of having that SNA identified. So there could be challenges in both directions, that the provisions and the approach of the plan is not strict enough, but also that it's too strict.
No other questions. Looks like reform. Oh, sorry, we've got one from Councillor Chung.
If you go back to the previous slide regarding appeals, I actually don't understand that last paragraph at all. What they're saying is that the IHP panel do not fulfil requirements to engage Māori. So does that mean they haven't spoken to them, or we haven't considered what they want, or what does it actually mean? And so what does the next paragraph or next sentence actually mean then?
So the NPSIB, which came in after we notified our proposed district plan, has a set of decision-making principles that planning provisions must be developed with and alongside Māori, and it's a very specific process that needs to be followed, and there are some certain outcomes that need to be achieved. And because of the timing of the NPS coming in after our plan was drafted and notified, the provisions which have been recommended to you don't fully implement those requirements of the NPS. So what the recommendation is there, that an upcoming plan change could be the way to resolve that non-compliance with those parts of the NPSIB. So as it is, the chapter that is coming to you and the provisions don't fully implement the NPSIB, but they implement them as much as they can in the context of a hearings process where some people have been able to have their say and the settings have changed partway through, and there's more work that needs to be done.
So the independent hearings panel have done very much in their decision what you're going to need to do with yours, which is balance the risks. And what they have said is effectively that these recommendations they've put up are the best position they could come to, but they recognise the weakness of that position is that under the RMA there is more engagement required with Māori. The second paragraph, which is the Te Ao Māori plan change, is the plan change we have briefed you at the last couple of briefings about, where we are working with iwi to implement what has been learned during this process into a plan change for consideration by the council. So that's dealing with subjects like papakainga, for example.
In terms of significant natural areas that are on City Council reserves and open space land, did the City Council challenge any of the designations, and if not, is it possible for the City Council to appeal?
Can we appeal our own district plan? I don't think anybody's ever asked me that before. What you could do.
So the first part of it is, was the SNA designations on any of the reserve land ever challenged by anyone on City Council reserve land, or I guess regional council reserve land as well for that matter? Was that ever challenged? That was the first part of the question.
I think I'm figuring out how to answer this. So when the SNAs were constructed, particularly over places like the city parks and reserves, a process was gone through with Park Sport and Recreation. So our colleagues there worked with us to refine those. In terms of us appealing, I don't believe we could appeal ourselves, simply because at a certain point I would be on both sides of the Environment Court. And so your best remedy there would be to set a new policy and to go to plan change to remove them. Anyway, should we move on to the wonderful, simple, straightforward world of reform? Very good. So the government has a constantly moving agenda that has been packaged as the Growing for Growth programs. That is composed largely of amendments to these 6 acts. So there's resource management reform, there is local government infrastructure funding reform, changes to the Public Works Act, the Land Transport Time of Use charging, changes to the Building Act, and water. Don't worry, I am not going to subject you to all of these. We're just going to concentrate on the first 2. So, in terms of resource management reform, this is divided into 3 tranches, or 3 phases. The first phase has been done. That has repealed the previous repealing of the RMA, which created the Spatial Planning Act and the Natural and Built Environment Acts. So those were briefly law. Then they were repealed and the RMA brought back, and now new planning acts are being drafted as part of phase 3. In phase 2, the fast track legislation has already proceeded through the House, and the first fast track applications are being considered now, and there are now amendments to the national direction, and those are the next part that's expected. And so those national directions are things like the national policy statements you've been hearing about. In particular, I would expect amendment to the national policy statement on urban development. Phase 3 will be due largely at the end of this year, next year, and that will repeal the RMA again, and this time we will get a Planning Act and I forget the other name, the Natural Environment Act. So we'll get a planning statute and an environmental management statute, effectively. What these acts do is they begin to target the planning system from the rather broad-based single integrated statute that is the RMA into two more specialist statutes. Essentially, what they'll do is they will limit the scope of plan making and target it towards more complex issue. They'll do this by implementing templating. So this was something that used to be done under the Town and Country Planning Act, where you picked your zones from a pattern book, and you can then deploy them across the city. And you reserve your more bespoke controls to edge cases, so things that might occur here that don't occur elsewhere in the country. There are also proposals to remove heritage regulation from the resource management system and put that into specialist regulation. There would also be the creation of a planning tribunal to hear appeals and also to see that we comply with standards. This would mean that you would have a tribunal as your first call of appeal rather than the Environment Court. There is also a requirement for a single regulatory plan for each region, and what you would do as council is approve a chapter into that plan. So this is quite similar to the way the Wairarapa plan is created, where you have 3 local authorities but 1 district plan. The only real difference there is the 3 local authorities in the Wairarapa generate 1 integrated plan, whereas this one would be divided spatially into chapters. There would also be a 30 to 50 year spatial planning instrument created to coordinate urban development and infrastructure. And there would also be streamlined designation processes for corridor protection and infrastructure. And there would be the replacement of treaty principles with the recognition of treaty settlements.
Oh, sorry, before you just go on to that one. So just on that regional plan, so you're saying that Kapiti, Porirua, Wellington, for argument's sake, we could be designated a region and we would end up with a single plan for that?
Oh, we are already designated a region in Greater Wellington, so we would have a single district plan across Kapiti, Porirua, Wellington, both Huts and the Wairarapa councils.
So in terms of the effect of something like that, where you've got, for instance, heavy residential development occurring in, say, Porirua or Kapiti, would that be covered by that? Because, would there be sort of coordination so that, what happens if we wanted densification and they wanted urban sprawl? How do you actually reconcile those sorts of things under something like this?
So that is where you would have to work together as councils through the spatial planning system to understand the infrastructure costs of those choices and then apportion them across the region. And so what you would be doing there is matching your infrastructure demand to your land zoning. So that was one of the original purpose of land zoning in New Zealand, was so that you could size infrastructure and generate enough certainty to invest. Land zoning came to be used to other things after that. But this is essentially a return of planning to its roots, which is how would you create that economic investment plan to build the water, transport, other infrastructures needed to service that development, and that would ultimately then govern your zoning pattern. In practice, you could easily end up with enabling of capacity at both the edge of the city and internally, and in that case, the recovery of infrastructure costs through levies would provide your signals to the market, which would decide whether you got densification or sprawl.
Wow, that'd be interesting. Okay, thank you. Sorry, Kat, Deputy Mayor Fern.
Just been doing that for the last 6 years and nothing came of it. But anyway, I'll refrain. Question, corridor protection. Does that mean we can protect corridors for light rail?
We are yet to see the particular bill, but from what I have read, that is the type of corridor it is talking about. And depending on how the test for certainty for designations is amended, it could well assist with such an enterprise.
Fantastic. Second question, replacement of treaty principles with recognition of treaty settlements. Can you just unpack that a little bit?
So at present, the Resource Management Act and most government legislation contains a clause which says that the Crown will act in accordance with the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, fairly standard legal drafting. This would remove that clause, and instead you would have recognitions of rights that have been gained through treaty settlement. So, for example, where Tū Whareatoa have come to accommodation with the Crown over waters flowing into Lake Taupo, that would be recognised through such a clause.
This might be a really silly question, it probably is. But when you say a preparation of a single regulatory plan, it presumably, and has different chapters, presumably the chapter on Wellington City could be a lot different from the chapter on Otaki.
You would be using those templated zones. So naturally, you would probably use a city centre zone, for example, where Otaki probably wouldn't. So the recognition of the spatial pattern of the city would be different. And you may have some specialist rules for very particular cases. So, for example, to deal with some of those really steep hillsides we tend to live on, or say some of the ceremonial activities that go around government and the national memorials, things like that. But in the main, the tool sets you're selecting from will be consistent nationally.
Does this mean that the work we've done already on our district plan is essentially going to get redone?
So this is where I give my standard answer of it's the law until it's not the law. I haven't yet seen the bill. I would, however, say that trying to convert a plan from 2000 into a new system would have been a lot harder than trying to convert a plan from this year into a new system.
Alrighty. So our work hasn't been for nothing.
I kind of have to believe that. The other bill, the other area of reform that goes hand in hand with land use reforms are the local government infrastructure funding stream. So this is an amendment to the Local Government Act, which will ensure that councils and other infrastructure providers can recover costs from developers for the capital expenditure necessary to serve growth over the long term. What this is delivering on the government's commitment that growth will pay for growth. What it does is it moves us from our development contribution to a system of targeted rates and development levies. So what that means is that we would set a catchment over a particular geographic area and then recover for the investment that is benefiting that area. And so that would create a series of levy zones. They would apply for each infrastructure service. That is quite important because you are not the only authority that would have power to do this. There would also be levies that could be raised by utility providers such as water entities, electricity entities, different transport entities potentially. And effectively, what that would do is rather than using the system where we currently require a contribution through a resource consent process, it would instead require a levy to be set and then recovered against that catchment and the development that takes place there. We would calculate that levy based off the overall growth costs and the expected levels of growth, and I would expect to see some national direction about how that is to be done. Those infrastructure providers will be required to use the prescribed methodology to ensure that it is fair and transparent, and the development levies would be subject to regulatory oversight. Some of the intricacies of this we do not yet know. So, for example, would that regulatory oversight see to the proportionality of levies in total, or whether it would be done per authority? So would you be looking at the total bill a developer may or a homeowner may pay, or are you looking at it just service by service to see if it's fair? So there's still a fair amount of detail that's to come on this. The reason it's important is it fits together with those spatial planning and land use reforms to rejoin the land zoning system to the infrastructure provision system. Very briefly, the reforms to the Public Works Act are to allow for a willing seller, willing buyer situation to help streamline the acquisition of land required for public works. The bill is currently is going to Select Committee. The land transport time of use charging, you've been through that process. Councillor Brown submitted on your behalf and you approved a submission. The changes to the Building Act are to allow for the regionalisation of building control authorities. There are also smaller reforms in there to allow for permitting of accessory dwellings, granny flats. And then water reform you're more acquainted with than I am after the past couple of weeks. So, are there any further questions?
My question was just around the levies. The first one was there are multiple authorities that are able to charge a levy. Is it clear yet whether all of the accounting will be done through the local authority or whether each authority would do its own billing for that levy?
I don't know the answer to that yet, Councillor.
And I had one more question, which was, I guess, in relation to the way that they were determined and recognising that perhaps, say, utility providers, there's a different provision for electricity and gas, as there is perhaps a similar tension between, say, NZTA with motorways and the Public Transport Authority with public transport. So do we have much idea about how the, I guess, perhaps differing views on the best way to provide for growth would then be put through in the levies that are charged to the end consumer?
No, but I expect to see that detail when we get a bill and through the national direction. I'm also hoping that national direction will help specify things like which sets of growth projections to use, etc., so they can be standardised easily across those systems. What it does mean as a council is that your spatial plan becomes much more important, because that becomes effectively the synchronising instrument across all of these systems so that utilities can coordinate their investments.
Cool. Thank you.
Now, in terms of amendments, so the second tranche of decisions is made under a different part of the RMA to the first tranche you went through last year. So this means that your options for how you may amend or reject or accept recommendations of independent hearings panels varies depending on how the recommendation has been made. So, for example, we've already been through one case with you where for cycle parking, the recommendation was made differently with regard to submitters than other parts of the plan, and so your options for how that those series of rules can be amended are different. To help with this, what I would suggest is over the next couple of weeks, if you have areas of the plan you are particularly interested in, we will work with you to shape up what the amendments are and what your options are. Once you are happy with words that deliver on your intent, then you can notify them to the chair of the committee and the other councillors to help with that meeting on the 13th of June, 12th of June. Thank you, Adam. Adam, yes. There will also be written advice, and what we will do is, as councillors ask us questions for written advice, we will circulate that to all councillors. I currently have requests for looking at electoral rules in the plan to do with signs, bicycle parking provision in buildings, and SNAs. If there are further things, please just send them to me. I will, and then we will work with you to help shape up your amendments and ensure that you're aware of how the different instruments work. I apologise; it's extremely technical, but this is the Resource Management Act in action. Yes, Councillor Chung.
What are you looking at for the requiring of cycle parking in buildings? Can we actually have any influence over that, or is that in the Building Act?
No, that is regulated under the district plan. It was in the last briefing, I believe, and the commissioners have recommended the reformatting of a table and the changes to the zones it applies to, and changes to the ratio. So we'll provide some written advice on that, as it's quite long.
But is it feasible or even possible for us to require building owners to actually provide parking in their buildings?
Yes, you can for bicycles, but you can't for cars in some areas under, I forget which instrument it is. The NPSUD, it removes parking minimums.
Okay, thanks.
Just a question about the levy point, because that is one which I'm interested in. So if the water company decides that it wants to levy people for stormwater, which is quite a likelihood, could they actually retrospectively impose some sort of, some version of effectively a property rate through the this district plan? So every house, every resident, every property had like $1,000 a year to pay towards stormwater. So
they wouldn't do it through the district plan. It would be under an Act of Parliament that would empower them directly. Until we see the content of the bill, I can't tell you whether they would have the power to impose a targeted rate. But it is likely that they would have the ability to raise a development levy. But again, it's really quite hard to answer questions of detail until I've seen what the government have actually written.
Thanks.
Just in terms of, so I know this is still wet finger in the ear sort of stuff in terms of development levies, and they do have the possibility of making the development of infrastructure more directly targeted to the cause of the development of the infrastructure rather than going into ratepayers. But in terms of a process of getting a development zone established, that's still a significant thing. I mean, would that be in the order of a plan change, or is it more like a resource consent? I mean, you're talking $50,000, or $200,000, $1 million. I mean, I'm not quite sure of the extent to which someone would need to go to use this instrument. And I was wondering if you could give us some guidance to that.
So what would happen is you would set the growth projections and the infrastructure investment needed to realise those under your spatial plan. And then those calculations would then feed the development levy. So, for example, if $100 of infrastructure was required to do 100 units, then your development levy would be $1 per unit. And that would then go onto that area. That would be different from any resource consent fee that took place. The resource consent fee would be just for the permitting of it. These instruments are for the recovery of the cost of infrastructure, essentially to ensure that ratepayers don't pay for it through their rates.
So I guess just to reiterate from all this, I was wondering also if you could, in the information circulated around the SNA stuff, if you could also circulate some information around the resource consent at the City Council and the scope of it, because it seems that it's unclear. I thought the resource consent is procured by the owner of the property.
Yes.
Generally, and if the City Council owns a reserve, whether the resource consent that the City Council is seeking could perhaps cover or be extended to support approved voluntary groups assisting the city. And
yes.
that sort of information would be very helpful.
Yep. Yes, we can provide that. I can tell you that a resource consent generally approves an activity, so it is possible for multiple parties to utilise a consent to do their work. It doesn't necessarily have to be, so for example, if I had a resource consent to tie bow ties and Adam wanted to tie a bow tie, he could do it too.
Okay. And lastly, could officers do some more work to make sure that the managers can remember the names of the staff?
Yes, Councillor Randall.
Is that a question? I've got a tiny little question. You know, with the granny flat allowance, will you still have to have a building consent, or is it just a resource consent? Which one do you sort of short circ?
It's an amendment to the Building Act, and it's largely to get you out of requiring building consent.
Oh, so anybody, you can just whip up any old thing you like in the back garden?
Yes, there are conditions. So you do have to be a certified builder, and there may be connection certificates that are required. Forgive me, I'm not an expert in the Building Act, unfortunately.
No, okay. No, thank you. That looks like it. Thank you very much. That was really informative.